Welcome back to 2.5 Hours. I'm Becker. We're in our Washington, D.C. studio and joined this week by Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He was the Chief of Staff for Colin Powell in the first Bush administration, George W. Bush, and by Professor Ibrahim Oweiss from Georgetown University and the author of a book, A Tale of Two Cultures. Welcome.
Thanks.
We're going to be discussing this week the recent meeting of AIPAC, the American-Israeli Political Action Committee, and generally speaking, the influence that the pro-Israeli lobby has here in Washington on policymakers, on Congress, on the president, and explore a little bit what's going on with that relationship and how it impacts on fundamental issues in the Middle East, both U.S. orientation towards Iran and towards Palestine. Colonel Wilkerson, Benjamin Netanyahu's visit that coincided with the AIPAC meeting, which also included a meeting with President Obama, that dominated the news here. And of course, central to it was the idea that the Israeli government and Netanyahu personally was pushing in the direction of a military strike against Iran. Different people in Washington, including the president, were responding to that specific pressure and taking, in some ways, a different position and in some ways the same position. How do you see it with Netanyahu's visit at the AIPAC conference and at the White House?
I think there are two perspectives to this that the American people are not getting and probably won't get. The first is why Netanyahu is operating the way he's operating. I think basically it's political for him. The only way he can hold on to power is to present this existential threat that Iran supposedly presents to Israel. He's got so many problems internally, domestically, not least of which is a rising gorge in the mouth of the Palestinian citizens, the Arab citizens of Israel, who are getting more and more desperate under what is essentially an apartheid state for them. He's getting more and more desperate about his own Israeli citizens, that is Jewish Israelis, who are increasingly kept down by the national security argument. Their labor movement has been virtually destroyed. We forget in 1948, Israel started out as a socialist state. They had communes, kibbutzes, and things like that. They are not that anymore. Less than 60 families in Israel have about 70% of the wealth. Over 50% of the land is owned by the security complex, the IDF and others. So he's got all kinds of domestic problems he has to divert Israeli attention from. And so Iran does that for him. And the second aspect of it is, and this is me as a military officer speaking, Israel could mount maybe a 100-plane strike and hit Iran. They'd be at the end of their operational tether. Without U.S. tanking, they'd be probably killing some of their pilots, just operationally, because it's so far away. And they could make the rocks bounce a little bit, but they could not do very much damage to Israeli nuclear facilities. And so what do you do after that? If the United States doesn't join, and even if it does, I still ask, what do you do after that? But if the U.S. doesn't join, it's really a rather ineffective strike. So if Israel wants to look worse than it did in July 2006 when it went into Lebanon, worse than it did when it heavy-handedly took on Operation Cast Lead and the operations in Gaza, go ahead and do it. It'll look pretty bad.
Professor Oweiss, Colonel Wilkerson paints a picture that Netanyahu is involved in the politics of diversion. And that the military efficacy of an Israeli strike is limited at best. Do you think that Netanyahu is using Washington for a domestic political platform, or do you think that this is part of a coordinated effort between the Israelis and the Americans for a possible military action in the Middle East once again?
Let me start by saying that this story of Iran has dominated the news. In my opinion, it is fabricated by AIPAC and the Israeli lobby in this country. It had been known all over because the mass media is under their control. The legislative branch of the United States is under their control. And therefore, they are really diverting the attention from the real problem there, that is the Palestinian Israeli issue, to something else. don't forget that President Bush came on the statement that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. And he said, no, he's lying. But it turned out later on who is lying in the final analysis. This is all a fabricated story. I don't think it will hold water, particularly after the inspection of the Atomic Energy Commission going there. And therefore, I think that the AIPAC has dominated the scene in the United States. They have a hold on the mass media, and therefore, even President Obama had retracted a few times from the position, from the original position that he had taken in order to face up to this problem and to find a solution for the tragedy of the Palestinians.
I hear you on that, but I want to ask Colonel Wilkerson to respond, if you would, about the relative weight of AIPAC and the Israeli lobby, or Israel itself, on U.S. governance. Certainly the position outlined by Professor Oweiss is not an uncommon one, but as a military man, in addition to being a political figure in the first George W. Bush administration, do you think that Israel is dominating U.S. foreign policy dictates in the Middle East? Is that what's happening?
I would be naive if I didn't say that AIPAC and organizations like AIPAC, and in that I include the ADL and other Jewish organizations which operate more or less on the right side of the political spectrum, I'd be naive if I said they weren't influential. They are, but so is the National Rifle Association, so is the Cuban lobby, the hardliners in particular, which you well know. So are other domestic groups. If I had to argue which was the most effective domestic lobby group, I'd say the AARP. One reason I don't join them is because they're so darned effective. So this
is, for those who don't know, that's the American Association of Retired
right.
People.
I think it's the largest lobby group in the country. And if I want to talk about a lobby group that really has a nefarious influence on the Congress and on this country, I'd talk about the one Kevin Phillips writes about in his books, and that's the unrecognized but nonetheless heavily moneyed and heavily lobbying investment banking, real estate, and other financial incentive groups who lobby the Congress all the time and who've gotten us into the mess largely that we're in right now economically and financially. So it's the way this system works. Does AIPAC have inordinate influence on U.S. national security policy? Yes, it does. But there are other just as nefarious interests at work here as AIPAC, and they range from, on the one hand, neoconservatives who believe that a conflagration in the Middle East will produce Jeffersonian democracies. How they get to that conclusion, I have no idea, but that's how they believe. On the one hand, all the way over to the military-industrial congressional complex, on the other hand, which would really like to see war become the main feature of the United States of America, because it's very, very lucrative for them.
Well, indeed, it seems like a dominant feature and a perpetual feature, the issue of war. Professor Oweiss, I want to go back to where President Obama and the Obama administration stands in relationship to the Middle East and to Iran, but not simply Iran, also to the Palestinians, and to see the trajectory of this administration since it came to office in January 2009. In January, when he took the oath of office, millions of people were here for the inauguration, a lot of enthusiasm, maybe euphoria, in fact. A few months afterwards, he went to Cairo on June 4th, 2009, and made a speech to the Muslim world, but really probably to the Middle East, trying to, it seemed, to rehabilitate the image of the United States following the disaster of George W. Bush. And he, for the first time, signaled or took responsibility that the U.S. had some role in the overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. He also called for the moratorium on future West Bank settlements. And yet, the crisis with Iran has become tenser. The danger of war is greater now than it was 3 years ago. And the settlements in the West Bank, instead of being stopped or pulled back, they've grown ever greater. What accounts for that? What accounts for this seeming reverse course for the Obama administration?
It is the fabricated story about the atomic bomb being developed by Iran. It's a fabricated story, and I say it, and I always continue to do that, and I will prove that, your history will prove that in the future. It is done by the Israeli lobby in this country. It was exactly the same thing of the weapons of mass destruction. That story emanated from Israel to start with. And this is something that the mass media do not usually talk about, because the mass media in the United States is so much dominated by AIPAC and by the Israeli lobby. And therefore, you have the media on the one hand, and you have stories that come up from time to time, and therefore, the wings of President Obama had been clipped as far as his original program was concerned, to find a peaceful solution to the problem, and to address the situation from the humane point of view. But the Israeli lobby, and particularly AIPAC, had managed to divert the attention completely and to clip his wings, President Obama's wings, as far as this is concerned. And therefore, many people have been disappointed with President Obama for having retracted from the position that he had originally started, and that was hopeful.
Is it a failure on the president's part to stand for what he believed in other words, to expend the capital necessary against naysayers, whether it's the Israeli lobby or the right-wing Christian evangelicals or the Republican Party hawks? Is it a failure to stand and pursue a policy that he secretly, silently harbors, or is it that he's moved in some other direction for another reason?
He is running for the presidency for the second term, and therefore his calculation and the calculation of his party was that they will have to slow down a little bit the rhetoric of the Palestinian state, of the two-state solution, and so on and so forth. And in order to be able to get the votes enough for this year's election by the end of this year. So it is really the body politics of the United States.
Okay. So by virtue of that argument, let's just assume that that's true, or assume that it may be true. If President Obama, Colonel Wilkerson, is reelected, which he may well be, partly because the rivals in the Republican Party seem to be so weak. That's one word to use.
Circular firing squad is what my colleagues call it.
Very good. So if he's reelected, and if what the professor is saying is true, that he's slowing down on harnessing or stopping West Bank settlements or intensifying the conflict with Iran, that pressure should presumably lift in a second Obama administration. Are you seeing that as like we're just in an election year, so the president has a short leash in terms of what he can do and innovate?
I'll wait until I see what he does in that first year if he's reelected, and I think it's highly likely he will be reelected because of that circular firing squad nature of my party, the Republicans. I don't know my party anymore, and those of us in it who are more or less moderates, Rockefeller, if you will, type Republicans, would like to get our party back, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. They may commit suicide this November, and then that would give us a better opportunity. I have some reservations about this, though, because I know the kind of people that President Obama has put around him. Dennis Ross, for example, in the first administration. Dennis Ross is Israel's lawyer. He's no honest broker. He's Israel's lawyer.
And what was his role, just for our viewers, in the Obama administration?
As I understand it, he had the whole portfolio, literally Western Asia, if you will. But he was focused, as he's always been focused, with Bill Clinton or whomever, on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the so-called Middle East peace process, which has rapidly not become a peace process, but a process under which Netanyahu, Likud, and others can essentially spread their wings all across the occupied territories and elsewhere too, for that matter, all the way into Jerusalem. So this is not a good development. I would be bold enough today to say that a one-state solution is coming, and that one-state solution is going to be increasingly viewed by the international community as an apartheid state, and Israel, by means of this one state, is going to lose its existence. And that's not what Israeli leaders want. That's not what the Israeli people want. That's why I think you see in poll after poll inside Israel, those that are done well, you see better than 60% of Israeli, that is to say Jewish Israelis, who don't believe an attack on Iran is the right policy, especially don't believe it, and the odds go up, or the numbers go up mightily here, if the United States is not with them. So this is a real problem for Israel right now and for her long-term security. Netanyahu and Likud are not for Israel's long-term security. They're for short-term political gain, and they are endangering Israel's long-term security by that policy.
Professor Oweiss, and I want to come back to Colonel Wilkerson and ask you the same question. There's reports in the last hours, in fact, that in the Israeli media and reverberating back in the Western U.S. media, that the Obama administration is making an arrangement with the Israeli government that if Israel doesn't carry out a unilateral military strike before the American election, that the U.S. government would provide the Israeli military with new advanced weapons, including powerful so-called bunker buster bombs and so on. The Obama administration so far has denied this, but do you see that kind of collaboration between the U.S. and the Israelis in terms of the Obama administration intensifying or expanding the Israeli military arsenal in a way that would make a war more likely?
I wouldn't be surprised at all if Israel does not cash on this deal as it did before. And therefore, they may get what they want from the United States. But in my opinion, that the Israeli government under Netanyahu and under the Likud is dividing the Israelis among themselves. And therefore, there is a big problem from within Israel. Clark Clifford, many years ago, came up with a superb article in Foreign Affairs saying how to save Israel in spite of itself. And the fact is that the Israeli politics as now stands and its direction of grabbing more and more land under the eyes of the world and of the United States, it really amounts to armed robbery because they're holding on the land with the power that the United States is giving them. And at the same time, they know that whatever they do, the United States will not reprimand them or not even apply the laws. There is a law of the United States when they gave those weapons that should not be really used against civilians, but the lawmakers had closed their eyes, and the administration had closed its eyes as far as this regard, as far as this point is concerned. And therefore, I would not be at all surprised that they would not come out empty-handed from this particular trip. If not a war against Iran, then it will be mass weapons and huge weapon deal to be given to Israel.
Which I might add, and I agree with that, and I would say that it's going to be even more injurious to Israel's national security interests because war right now is anything but conventional. And I don't see any change in that for some time to come. We've learned this lesson, we being the armed forces of the United States, particularly Marine Corps and Army, bitterly in Iraq and Afghanistan. Conventional forces are not the future of conflict. Guerrilla forces are, revolutionary forces, whatever you want to call them. Things like Hezbollah and Hamas and other Lashkar-e-Taiba, Al-Qaeda, those kinds of things are what we're going to be confronted. We, being what I would call the world that likes stability, that likes economics, likes trade, likes making people's lives better, prosperous, and so forth. That part of the world is going to be at war with, for some time to come, this group that's out there trying to contest this for various reasons, religious and otherwise. So Israel's surrounded by 400 million potential guerrillas. I would not want to have my last bet on the Israeli Defense Forces, on conventional weaponry and so forth. What I'd want to be betting on is negotiations, diplomacy, economics, finance, all the other tools of national power. I'd want to be betting on coming to some kind of modus vivendi with these peoples, especially since they've started their own awakening now, which no one knows, from Morocco, which is getting ready to go, all the way over to Afghanistan, down to Chabahar and Bandar Abbas, what is going to happen? No one knows. Syria's a mess. Libya's a mess. Egypt looks like it could become a mess any day now. So this is not conducive to Israel's long-term security. She needs to be concerned with coming to some kind of accommodation, particularly with the Palestinians, that will leave her looking like, other than what the doctor just described, as the last holdout for imperialism in Western Asia. This is not going to help Israel. So,
well, it's. I mean, you mentioned in the beginning that the Israeli state, when it started, had a social democratic feature to it. It was co-sponsored at the UN by both the Soviet Union and the United States. Since then, the politics of Israel have gone sharply to the right.
In consonance with our own going in that direction, too, which is interesting.
And also, and this is, we're going to take a break in a few minutes, but when we come back, I want to discuss it. It wasn't always the case that the United States and Israel walked arm in arm in terms of Israeli politics, Israeli military initiatives. Certainly in 1956,
Dwight Eisenhower slapped them.
when Israel united with Britain and France to invade Egypt, the American government and the Soviet government, but the American government said no, and the Israeli invasion stopped pretty promptly.
Well, actually, the British and the French stopped pretty promptly. The Israelis were, as usual, obstreperous as hell and fought Eisenhower for months afterwards, even to including trying to keep the wrecks in the Suez Canal from being cleaned up.
Granted, but at the end of the day,
they quit.
They quit, and then in 1967, in the June War, the Israeli war that took the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights and the Sinai. And from that time on, the United States and Israel seem to have been bound at the hip from the point of view of military strategy. Not always, but fundamentally. Was it the case that in 1967, when the U.S. was bogged down in Southeast Asia, unable to win in the Vietnam War, and the Arab nationalist revolution was taking place, that there was sort of a shift made where the United States viewed Israel as an extension of U.S.-American military power in a vital region when the U.S. was somewhat limited? My point being, is it possible that that was a historically defined period and that the U.S. could, as it did in the early days in the 1950s, not have a complete unity of views with the Israelis and in fact separate themselves from the Israelis because of a divergence of perceived national interests?
Well, I think this is an important point you've just touched upon. During the Cold War, however imperfect our policy, you could argue persuasively and I think realistically that Israel was sort of the unsinkable aircraft carrier at the eastern end of the Mediterranean and therefore was a strategic asset to the United States. I would argue also, though, that since the end of the Cold War, Israel has been a strategic liability for the United States. And I can give you all kinds of reasons for that.
Well, give a couple.
Well, first of all, look at where our assets are that are hard strategic assets. They aren't in Israel. They're elsewhere. The only thing we had in Israel that would be hard strategic asset would be our war reserve stocks, and the Israelis, I'm told, have pretty much bled those down along with us in Iraq. So Israel is not a very big strategic asset. Look where our assets are. They're in Bahrain, where our largest fleet headquarters is, the Fifth Fleet. Look where our oil dependence is, even now as we sanction Iran, Saudi Arabia. Look where elsewhere we have assets in the Middle East, and you won't find them in Israel. The hard strategic assets are in other countries than Israel. And then comes the big point. The big point is, as David Petraeus testified, our failure to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem puts a big red bullseye on every American sailor, Marine, airman, soldier in the Middle East, in Western Asia, whether they're in Kabul or Bahrain or Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever. That's what it is, because we fail to satisfy that problem, to meet even the restrictions of being an honest broker instead of Israel's lawyer. And by that, we exacerbate our problems with the Muslim community in that region of the world.
We're gonna have to take a short break. We're gonna come back, and I want to focus again still on the strategic, potentially strategic shifting grounds for the U.S.-Israeli relationship in regard to the Middle East. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our second segment of 2.5 hours. We're joined in our Washington, D.C. studio by Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He was Colin Powell's chief of staff when Colin Powell was Secretary of State in the first George W. Bush administration, and by Professor Ibrahim Oweiss. He's a professor at Georgetown University, the author of the book, A Tale of Two Cultures. And I'm going to hold that book up if people want to take a look at it. It's got a preface by former President Bill Clinton. We're talking about the influence of AIPAC, the pro-Israeli lobby on U.S. policy, and also the shifting long-term strategic character of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, which we can see has gone through different phases. I want to ask you both this question and ask you if this has, from your point of view, any sort of foundational credibility in terms of U.S. policy. The U.S. had in the Shah of Iran a strategic ally. It had in Mubarak in Egypt a strategic ally. In both of those countries, large, important countries in the Middle East, two of the three most important perhaps, there was a revolution by the people, and the dictator or authoritarian figure who was the American ally had to depart from the scene, and that followed in the case of Iran by a revolution and the Islamic Republic. In the case of Mubarak, it's an unfolding, unfinished revolution, but unstable. In the case of Israel, however, while there is a difference of opinion within the Israeli body politic, as a settler regime and in an environment that's considered unfriendly because it is a settler regime, does the character of the Israeli state itself provide a kind of constancy for the U.S. foreign policy in this geostrategic, resource-rich part of the world? Because it's unlikely that there will be an Israeli-type revolution given the nature of society. Is that part of the reason the U.S. could be so attached to Israel?
Do you want me to start on that?
Sure.
I think there's some validity to that supposition. I think it's false, though, and I think it's false for a number of reasons, not least of which is that, as I pointed out, I think Israel is becoming a strategic liability, and Israel is a liability to itself. And by that, I don't mean the Israeli people, Palestinian, Arab, or Jew, so much as I mean its leadership. Its leadership would be thrown out of office tomorrow if there were an alternative. The unfortunate thing is the composite that Netanyahu has put together, which includes the ultra-right and his own Likud party and others somewhere in between, That's an untenable coalition, but it cannot be thrown out simply because there's nothing to replace it. Ask yourself why there's nothing to replace it. The Israeli political dialogue has shrunk. It's shrunk to from that 1948 dialogue, which was robust and even radical and incredibly full of energy, has shrunk to nothing other than Likud and Netanyahu. That is an incredible development in such a short time. I wonder if Israel can survive, given its own internal failure to live up to its values, to its democracy, to its founding fathers' desires.
And Professor, same question to you that I posed to Colonel Wilkerson. What do you think about that? Is it impossible for there to be a real people's revolution in Israel, as happened in Iran in '79 or happened last year in Egypt, and thus the Israeli government, in spite of its political character, is an element of stability? It's both dependent on the United States in some ways and thus functions as a stable proxy.
I don't think that there will be a revolution inside Israel itself. There will be a debate, and a strong debate from within, and it's continuing because of the democracy that applies only to the Israelis, but not to others. The Arab Israelis are not at all part of it. There is something which had been termed since I was professor at Harvard that is called the Newton-Oweiss law. Newton mentioned that every action has a reaction opposite in direction and equal in force. I modified that in social sciences, and I said that every action has a reaction, not necessarily opposite in direction and not necessarily equal in force. Look at World War I, started because of one prince was killed. Look at the drastic reaction to this. And in my opinion, World War I and World War II are one with 20-year only pause. So the casualties of World War I and World War II mounting to millions of people suffering because of one person that was originally killed. And therefore, as far as Israel is concerned, if it continues along the same lines and with AIPAC helping Israel, this blind ally, I don't think that Israel will survive for more than 20 years or 30 years at the most.
Well,
let me just pick up on that for just a second. I agree that the Archduke Ferdinand's assassination was the precipitate cause for the mobilization that led to World War I, and I agree completely with his historical sketch of the interregnum in World War II and hundreds of millions of casualties. But let me point out also, if I may, the last period of intense globalization preceded 1914. The last period, arguably in a relevant sense, historical relevant sense, was as intense as the period has been for the past 30, 40 years. We laid the first undersea cables and talked to people in London in instantaneous time, in Paris and so forth. We're looking at similar circumstances right now. And that's one reason I really, really am concerned about an attack on Iran by Israel, by the United States, by both in combination or whatever. We could set off a series of events which I could describe to you with some accuracy, I think, and some persuasiveness that would lead the entire region into an interminable war that would produce tens of millions of casualties and would occupy the treasury of the United States of America until it was utterly bankrupt. And that is a very scary scenario.
Well, as you're both mentioning, there is the unintended consequences, whether it's a lawful unintended consequences or not. They're clearly identifiable. And isn't it, I want to just depart, since you've raised the specter of the unintended consequences having very dire impact on the United States, on Europe, on the Middle East, of course, on the principally on the people there, but perhaps people everywhere. Is it possible that there are elements within the United States establishment who also, like you and like the professor, see this specter and recognize it for the danger that it is? And if so, wouldn't they, as they have before other major conflagrations, start to be sounding the alarm in a very vocal way about the prospects?
I think to a certain extent they have. I don't know if you saw the full-page ad we put in the Washington Post on Monday, we being myself and other intelligence and military professionals. Minor thing, but we were trying to give President Obama a little more political space. We let the White House know in advance. I think that I like to think they were pleased by the fact that we did that. The political space is rapidly drying up, and he's rapidly being painted into a corner by the Congress, and the Congress doesn't seem to know what it's doing. The American people rate the Congress right now as low as they've ever rated it in its history, at least in the history that we've polled. Some polls have it down below 10%, that is single digits. The Congress is judged ineffectual, even lunatic full by the American people. And yet they march on doing this. Clearly they're not representing the views of the American people. So how do you get to this point? How do you get to a point where things are so indecipherable in terms of the politics? I mean, we can pull the little pieces out and say, I understand that, I understand that, I understand AIPAC, I understand the Jewish lobby, I understand Americans, I understand their ignorance, I understand their ignorance in particular about Persia, about Iran. And yet, you put it all together and you say, we might go into this incredible, possibly region-wide, possibly global conflagration. And look at the debate. The debate is inane.
The debate is paltry or inane, and even the opposition to within the establishment. I mean, not people in the streets who are smarter, but the people in the establishment who are cautious or worried about the danger of a regional conflagration. It is very muted, I would say, very muted voice. The fact that you had to pay for a Washington Post ad, a lot of money to make a case means that it's not widely discussed within the media. People have to buy advertising in order to make that statement. And we see that it's not just Iran. There's also what's going on in Syria. And I want to just depart for a second and talk about Syria. Because here you had Russia and China at the UN saying, well, we learned the lesson of Libya. We're not going to go along with any kind of resolution because it will be used as a pretext for a full-scale Western military intervention. So they said no to that. That allowed the Assad government space. It resumed a military offensive and maybe has the initiative. But you see within the United States, like in the Washington Post, voices demanding, in spite of President Obama's cautionary words initially, that more be done, meaning another Libya-type intervention. Do something. And McCain and Lieberman and Lindsey Graham calling for bombing again. The rising chorus of an intervention in Syria. Isn't Syria, too, one of those places that has, like Yugoslavia was at the beginning of World War I or Iran, also the possibility, because of its international connections with Russia, with China, with the rest of the region, as having a major, dangerous, expansive war, something far beyond these cheerleaders for war could possibly know about right now?
Well, let me just say, absolutely so, and ask the doctor for his comments.
I agree with the fact that the consequences could be grave, and the Middle East is already in turmoil, not only in Syria, but also there are some other problems in other countries in the region. Every action has a reaction, not necessarily opposite in direction, not necessarily equal in force. So we see really a snowballing of these problems. But the worst that could ever happen in that region would be a war against Iran. this will be devastating consequences, including, if I may say, wiping out Israel from the map. Iran does not have an atomic bomb, but it has enough of long-range missiles that it can direct against Israel from wherever, from their own territory. And it would be devastating in the region. And the whole region could suffer, and millions of people would be killed as a result of this particular wave, particular direction of the danger of Iran, and we should curtail Iran, we should attack Iran, and this is all coming from Israel, from the Likud. It's exactly the same way that it did to George W. Bush by giving them the false impression and pushing the United States into a war in Iraq, from which we're suffering up until now. And I must tell you, I'm not a military man. I used to be in the just only for a short period of time. But there is a limit to what the military can do.
Let me add.
Go ahead.
Let me add to that. I think, as the doctor has intimated, for Lindsey Graham, for Joe Lieberman, for John McCain, and for others like them, Syria represents a backdoor into Iran, because we know positively that there are elements in Iran, the IRGC, I would assume, is the principal element, that are supporting Bashar al-Assad with arms and forces on the ground in Syria. So if we get involved in Syria, we automatically get involved with Iranians in Syria. Well, that's a good thing, right? No, that's a horrible thing, because then we get sucked into this cauldron that is Syria right now, which is really not being reported on accurately by the U.S. media, by global media, except in little pockets from here and there. The Arab League's report, for example, was quite clear that casualties were occurring on both sides of roughly equal consequence. So it's not just Bashar al-Assad who's bringing the hammer down on his people. It's also the opposition, whatever that is, and it has many elements, that's presenting casualties to Bashar al-Assad, even to the extent that they're killing Syrian soldiers who are loyal to Assad and then dragging them out of the point where they've killed them and saying they're defectors and that they were trying to defect when they were killed by their own soldiers and so forth and so on. So this is not something, it's a civil war, and it's not something you want to wade into without really thinking about it hard. And John McCain and Lindsey Graham and Joe Lieberman haven't had a day in the past year where they thought about anything hard, which is really troubling, that you beat the drums of war when you haven't really given it thought and you haven't given it consideration.
Well, clearly in Syria, as has happened.
Oh, by the way,
go ahead.
Libya is definitely not a success story right now. So I would hardly bring Libya up as an example of how NATO, the United States, the West in general, can impact dictators. Libya is a mess right now.
Indeed. Libya appears that it's potentially suffering a separation that may be a permanent separation with the eastern part of the country, an oil-rich part of the country around Benghazi, declaring semi-autonomy, and who knows what kind of fragmentation could come next.
And people forget, too, that by a factor of 5 to 1, that's 5 to 1, Eastern Libya provided recruits for al-Qaeda in Iraq to kill our soldiers and Marines. Libya was the greatest provider of soldiers for al-Qaeda in Iraq.
The thing that I want to focus on in our last few minutes is that we can see, at least in this discussion, and I think elsewhere, that the stakes are high in Syria. It's complicated in Syria. It is a civil war. The Assad government, whether you like it or loathe it, it obviously has a big base of popular support. It's not the entire people against the Syrian government. There is an element of propaganda and disinformation so that the rebels are always presented as the victims and the government force is always the criminals. all of these things that are attendant with conflict and with civil war, not that unusual. But in the U.S. media, it's not just Lieberman. I mentioned Lieberman, Graham, McCain, because they've made a cottage industry for themselves out of becoming this voice of endless war, perpetual war. But when you turn on CNN, MSNBC even, the more liberal station, and all of the networks in America, the American people and the political discourse is basically reflecting that view. Now, many people have to also think, well, Israel has, as more people are talking about, hundreds of nuclear weapons, doesn't belong to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, isn't inspected by the IAEA. Iran, on the other hand, is probably the most inspected place on the planet. And yet, no sanctions on Israel, even though some can make the case that, many could make the case that that's actually what should happen. What should happen then? Given this whole political situation, the dangers, the nature of the discourse, the one-sidedness of the discourse, what would you recommend to policymakers about what should be done? I'll ask you both that question. Maybe start with you, Professor.
I think the first thing is that we should declare our independence from Israel. Israel has its own agenda. The United States has its own agenda. This does not necessarily mean that two agendas coincide with one another. And therefore, the United States should pursue a much stronger point of view regarding its own interest, and not to have its policy be dictated by a small nation thousands of miles away from here. And therefore, the first step is to get the United States government its act together to enforce its policy that had been repeated by president after president after president. Even President Reagan came up by saying that we are going to see a Palestinian state in a few years from now. And so the United States government should look up its own record and should direct its attention to the right policy given the United States' interests, not the interests of a small country 7,000 miles away from here.
Okay, Lawrence Wilkerson, same question to you.
The United States right now, in its decision-making process, is not a lot different from France, England, Austria, Germany, and a host of other countries involved in that mess we just talked about that started in 1914 and didn't end until 1945. That is a lamentable situation. I don't know what you do about it. But politics is the art of the possible, and so you can't bite it like you were trying to eat an elephant all at one time. So if I were President Obama and I were the more sane and sober members of his administration, I would mark my time as best as possible between now and the election, trying to achieve something that might even be an October surprise, for example, that I would throw at my Republican opposition and say, there, I've got a deal with the Iranians. Knowing they're going to eat it up and try to dissect it and present it to the American people as being a sellout. But nonetheless, I'd make it so formidable that it would not be perceived that way by at least enough of the electorate to get me reelected. That's what I do in that short time period we have left to the election. And that's politics, is the art of the possible.
And then what?
Then after that, in the 4 years I had left, I would just I'd convince myself that I needed people around me that were more or less amenable to America not being the military hegemon of the world, but being a cooperative leader of Paris inter pares, if you will, rather than, you know, the supreme God of the world. And with those people, I would work on all of these problems, not least of which would be the Israeli-Palestinian situation. Let's face it, we've given Israel, even conservatively speaking, somewhere close to $100 billion since we just put this thing on automatic since the Israeli-Egypt peace treaty. We've probably given them close to 180, 190 billion over the time, maybe even vastly more than that. That's a lot of leverage. The Israeli people in poll after poll say to their leadership, we don't want you alienating the United States. That's a red line for us. So let's use that red line. Let's leverage that red line. Let's go to the Israeli people. And if that doesn't work, then we go right to the leadership. If it continues to be people like Avigdor Lieberman, clearly a racist, and Bibi Netanyahu and the others he has in his coalition, then we go straight to them and we say, you want any more money? You want the United States on your side? Then you better make a deal and you better do it yesterday. And it better look good. And it better be upheld. Do I think that's going to happen? In the face of what we've talked about here, AIPAC, the Jewish lobby, and people like McCain and Lieberman and others who unfortunately probably aren't going to go away, I don't know. But I'd damn sure give it a try.
Let me just say one thing, and Professor, jump in then. I mean, I can see from the last few years, though, even the last 5 or 6 years, something of a sea change. It's a little bit passive still, but a sea change in terms of American public attitudes towards Israel. And I think it's not just in the street, it's not just in grassroots, it's also perhaps in the establishment. The aggression against Lebanon in 2006, which was a military failure, exposed Israel in a way that elicited enormous opposition in the United States. And then the bombing campaign right after Christmas in 2008 against Gaza, which was, a heinous attack, also elicited more public opposition. And now today you can see, you hear even establishment voices talking about the need for the United States to be different in terms of its orientation in foreign policy than what are perceived as the narrower national interests or so-called national interests of Israel. Is it possible, given the fact that Israel is a settler regime, and while it seems to not care about world public opinion, it certainly cares about the United States, its basic patron, that if politics shift in the United States fundamentally, many people in Israel who are unhappy anyway, economically and politically, could just pick up and say, we're going back to the United States or Europe. In other words, many are first and second generation emigres. In other words, and to Russia, isn't it possible that Israel, and this is part of its extreme right-wing politics, the leadership itself realizes that the whole project is somewhat fragile in spite of its apparent omnipotence in a military sense? Is that part of the calculations here?
There is no doubt about what you're saying, that Israel is going to be dissolved from within if it continues along the same line. In order to save Israel in spite of itself, it has to live within the region in peace. And it is a big farce by saying that let them negotiate a peace treaty. You cannot negotiate between a lion, you cannot have a negotiation between a lion and a cat. All what the cat can do is to scratch, but the lion is too big, and therefore this must be a forced solution on Israel, and this forced solution will actually save Israel in the long run from the consequences of a blind policy and a blind tactic that it had been pursuing. Unfortunately, it is supported by AIPAC, and in my opinion, AIPAC is not looking for the best interests of Israel in the long run. It is creating a situation of hatred, and it is creating a situation of apartheid in the country, and therefore there must be. Let me just finish by saying that the new administration, or whoever is going to be the new president of the United States, will have to get involved in this issue for the sake of the United States and its principles, and should not create more enemies to the United States.
We have 60 seconds left, so you may have the last word, Colonel Wilkerson. Very quickly, there's been a big change in Egypt. Clearly, since 1979, the enactment of the Camp David Agreement sidelined Egypt, the Arab world's largest army, from the Arab-Israeli conflict. But the situation in Egypt itself, as it is changing, will have a profound impact on the fate of the Palestinians, for instance. And of course, again, Israel needed that alliance from the point of view of reducing its own isolation. Just in the last now 30 seconds, how do you think the Egyptian revolution will impact on this question?
Well, I think generally speaking, with Egypt being a key factor in the Arab awakening, which is what I like to call it, because I don't think it's a spring that's going away into a winter, is going to be adverse to Israel's interests if Israel stays on the same track. I agree with the professor. Israel has to learn to live with the people in the region, and the region has to learn to live with Israel. And if the U.S. can facilitate that, and I think it can, along with the EU and others, then that's what we should be doing. We should not be talking about interminable war.
Okay, I have to wrap it up there. Thank you, Professor Oweiss, Colonel Wilkerson. I'm Ibrahim Becker. This is the conclusion of 2.5 hours. We'll see you next week.